Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Tatyana Kleyn, and I'm Principal Investigator for the City University of New York Initiative on Immigration and Education, which we refer to as CUNY-IIE. We are funded by the New York State Education Department through their Office of Bilingual Education and World Languages. We are so glad that hundreds of you from all over the US and beyond have joined us to launch 2 new modules on translanguaging and trauma-informed practice. Before we jump in, a few housekeeping announcements. Please submit any questions in the Q&A box that is at the bottom menu of your Zoom window. We also encourage you to share your thoughts or reactions with members of the audience in the chat window, and actually let us know who you are and where you're coming from. Finally, this event is being recorded, and we will share the recording with everyone who registered, and we will post it to our website for streaming. Next slide. And next slide. In 2021, CUNY-IIE developed 4 professional development modules to accompany the Supporting Immigrants in Schools video series. The modules address the areas connected to the videos, specifically, as you see, key immigration issues, refugees and immigrants in schools, immigration in elementary schools, and immigration in secondary schools. While using these modules with educators, we noticed 2 critical areas connected to our CUNY-IIE grounding principles were missing. So that brings us to our next slide. We noticed that educators of immigrant origin students sought out ways to integrate students' language practices through translanguaging and to support them socio-emotionally through trauma-informed practices. This brings us to today's launch on these 2 important areas and educator modules that we hope each of you will consider for your own context. So now we're going to stop screen sharing, and it will be my honor to introduce our first 2 speakers of today's webinar. In the interest of time, I'll give a very brief introduction and we'll paste their full bios in the chat. Our first speaker is the one and only Dr. Ofelia García, Professor Emerita of Urban Education and Latin American, Iberian, and Latino cultures at the CUNY Graduate Center, who will, of course, be talking to us and framing translanguaging for us. She will be followed by Dr. Kleyn, Assistant Professor of Multilingualism and English Education at Queens College, also at CUNY, because it's a CUNY kind of day. So he will be framing trauma and specifically trans trauma before we move into sharing our modules. Doctors Garcia and Ley, we are truly honored to be able to listen to you and to learn from you. Gracias and come for joining us at CUNY-IIE. Dr. Garcia, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias, Tatyana. It's really an honor for me to be here with Khánh and especially to be framing the wonderful work that Maite and Ashley have done in the modules. And my 10 minutes are to be spent talking about what does translanguaging have to do with the education of immigrants in New York City. And I thought that it would be interesting, I think important to frame today's talk around a song that maybe some of you know. It's a song by La Santa Cecilia, which, as many of you know, it's a band that plays hybrid music, Latin music and US music and world music and cumbia and rumba and bolero and tango and jazz and even klezmer. And they have a wonderful song called Ice Yellow. And of course, what they do is they play with this idea of ICE as an acronym of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And the line that I think we need to focus on today is, El hielo anda suelto por esas calles, nunca se sabe cuándo nos va a tocar. Ice is loose on the street, we never know when we'll be next. And so I thought that that was an appropriate metaphor for why translanguaging is relevant for immigrants. ICE, of course, is an instrument of surveillance, of excluding, of deporting, of silencing. And what I want to tell you is that language in schools has also been turned into ice, into hielo, a means of excluding something that is cold, that is solid, that is frozen, and that is white. And it's contained in a mold that it never allows it to de-ice. It continues to be surveilled. And it never allows for this flow of this powerful corriente, this powerful current, this translanguaging corriente of engagement, of learning, of languaging, of love, of being both Americans and immigrants. And English, of course, is frozen according to that mold that excludes all minoritized, racialized speakers, especially immigrants, who are always then seen as incomplete, staining the white ice with color. And then the rest of the languages, Spanish, Chinese, and the other languages are also frozen. So languages in schools are, again, compartmentalized into different ice cube compartments. And they are just like ice. They act as instruments of exclusion, of silencing voices. So the question for me is, how do we then defrost, de-ice named languages so that they flow freely, so that speakers who do language differently can really express their emotions, their thoughts, so that they can learn, so that they can feel secure, so that they don't always feel inadequate, inferior, or as poor language users. And I think one of the ways in which to de-ice language in schools is through translanguaging, and you will see it in the work that Maite Sánchez has done in the modules. So what does translanguaging mean? Translanguaging simply means centering the students' voices, the ways they do language, not the named languages, not the way that it has been iced by nation states and schools in ways that really prevent us from listening to students' voices and their very different practices. It requires us to view students, immigrant students, from an angle of strength and their own languaging capacities, how they do language again, and not as iced by racial linguistic ideologies, by perceptions that if you're an immigrant, you already don't speak well. And I think it's very important, especially to understand that translanguaging is about giving students freedom to use their full unitary repertoire, this interdependent web of meanings that we all have, that we can get from our own experiences, our own emotions, the way that we live, because that is the only way to really de-ice language and let this translanguaging corriente flow, which, by the way, is very important to note. That is what we do with monolingual students, right? With monolingual English-speaking students, we allow them access to all their resources. And yet what happens with bilingual students and students that are different is we do not allow them access to all their language resources. And by language resources, I mean not only linguistic features, I also mean all our bodily gestures, our role-playing, our visuals, etc., right? So all of this is part of what we have called the translanguaging corriente, this current that really needs to exist in the classroom so that children can really engage with the text and with the learning that's going on. Translanguaging also means then not focusing on these iced language features of what is said to be English or another language, but on the student's capacity to language, to find meaning, to create, to inquire, right? So many times we are just so focused on the language features and we forget whether to think about whether this student really can use language in ways that are adequate, that are appropriate, and that they find meanings for themselves through their own means. I want to remind you of the work of the Martinican scholar Edouard Glissant, who always used to say that to really understand opacities, you have to focus on the weave. that is not language-specific features, but actually the ways in which students do language, right? How do students then, immigrant students who arrived yesterday, it's not that they don't already do language, they do language well, but you have to make sure that you understand that there's a difference between the specific features of language that schools seem to have iced and therefore think that this is the only thing that is worth it. And you have to really distinguish that between the ability of human beings to language, to make sense, to use this human semiotic means of communication that we're also capable of. So translanguaging is to de-ice because for social and cognitive justice of immigrant students, we have to start with language, because many times that is the only thing that we see with immigrant students, the fact that they do not have a language. And we have to start by saying they do have a language, right? And they can really translanguage. So just to remind you, and just as an introduction to Maite's module, taking up translanguaging in school is not simply strategies. Whether you're an ENL teacher or a bilingual teacher or a heritage language teacher, it's not about strategies. It's about opening up translanguaging spaces so that that current, that engagement can really flow. In the book with Johnson and Seltzer, we talk about 3 strands to the translanguaging pedagogical practices. The stance, which we have called the junto stance, that is together stance, not thinking of languages as separate autonomous entities with different features. As shifts, that is the way in which you then follow, you become a co-learner in the classroom and you follow the student's corriente, and as design. And the design is important. I think Maite will speak more of it, but it's certainly about respecting spaces and opening up translanguaging spaces to scaffold the instruction, because you want to know whether the students do not know the language or do not know the concept, to deepen understandings, and of course, most important of all, to transform subjectivities, because immigrant students in schools are subjected to this inferiority, deficiency, subjectivity, which we have to transform into one that is more positive. Muchas gracias, and this is now Khãn's turn.
Thank you, Ofelia, and thank you, Tatyana and CUNY-IIE for inviting me to be here to engage and to be part of this conversation with all of you. Ofelia mentioned about ICE, the nation state and institution policing the language practice of marginalized community, and I'm going to talk about a little bit about how nation states and institution play a role in continuing and inflicting trauma on marginalized community. Considering what's going on in the Middle East right now, we don't learn from history, we continue to do that to marginalized community. We continue to inflict trauma on them. And briefly, I'm going to talk about the theorization of trans trauma, which is the relocation of trauma from individual bodies to the institution. Then I will delve onto how Educator can teach using this lens, through the lens of trans trauma, what kind of pedagogical practices that Educator would use to help students who endure trauma, especially institutionalized and collective trauma. I want to talk about the literature and the work of how the theorization of trans trauma. It's first is a literature on trauma of Judith Herman, who ground trauma to political and social context, and also the literature on race, which is Saucer would talk about race as not just a categories or just black and white, but the relocation of race from the body to the institution, looking at race as Western imperialism, as colonialism, more than just categories. And also, Ofelia work on translanguaging asked me to look at trauma in looking at trauma that is non-normative, right? Disrupting trauma, disrupting how trauma enact in human bodies, that embodiment. And translanguaging, the trend here is to transcend, to go beyond the name language. And here I am going beyond the trauma of individual bodies and relocating that to the institution. And also, from my lived experience, theorizing in the flesh, my parents are a product of the Vietnam War. I am the product of the Vietnam War. My dad was sent to re-education camp for 8 years where he was tortured. And he endured a lot of trauma on that, and he was fighting that war until his death, and moved as refugees in Philadelphia and growing up in a poor working class background. I didn't know how to deal with that trauma of my dad and of me and my parents living in Philly, where schooling erased my experience. Schooling erased, I didn't learn anything, schooling erased who I am, my language, my identity. So all of that helped me conceptualize trans trauma, right? Is that relocation. And to the next half of this talk, I want to talk about how educators can use this trans trauma lens when teaching youth who endure trans trauma, who have been impacted by institutionalized trauma, what I call collective trauma. And that is, I think, using the arts and putting the emphasis on collectivism, and I think connecting students with their communities, centering the students, whether it's the student language practices, as Ofelia said earlier, centering their lived experience, centering their communities. And I just want to give you some example of what I have done in the classroom to help with my students who experience trans trauma in the classroom. And that is some of the thing I've done with students is spoken words. I have my students write about their experience of being bilingual in the classroom. I have students write about the inequity, the injustice they face as being a woman of color. And they would perform it, everyone would perform it, we'll talk about it. So that's just that collectivism and the arts, right? And I want to go back here, I want to backtrack a little bit and emphasizing translanguaging, as translanguaging provided me that space to use the arts for students to heal from their trans trauma. It's going beyond that name languages, right? That looking at like, oh, we should the classroom, it's supposed to be learning of words of name languages, but the classroom can be fun and can be a space for healing for students who experience collective trauma, institutionalized trauma, or what I call trans trauma. I have students do photo voice project. I go into neighborhoods and have students take pictures of their neighborhoods, multilingual signs, or of their parents, of their family, doing just regular things, and have them write about it in multiple languages, in dynamic language practices. I have students do a podcast where they talk about their experience being brown and immigrant growing up in New York City. I have students do theater, do write, do collective writing, and then tell the stories and share it with the classroom and share with folks in the community. So those are the things that I think that will help students who experience trauma to heal. And I want to, before I end, I want to emphasize this collectivism, right? This collective healing, because the trauma that immigrants and refugee students experience it's just an individual trauma. You know, we can't say, oh, what's wrong with you? Let's diagnose you, right? But it's a collective things, and it's a collective experience, and that requires collective healing. And I just want to end with that.
Wow, so much to think about. Thank you both, Drs. Garcia and Dr. Lei, for your insights. You have really set us up beautifully and critically to move into our modules. And we will have you back for the Q&A, which reminds me to remind everyone here, if you have questions that come up, please use the Q&A feature to ask your questions there. And now, it is my great pleasure to introduce our module authors who have worked tirelessly, and I want to highlight tirelessly, to ensure that the modules are relevant, that they are accessible, and that they are dynamic. And as I did with our first speakers, I will only briefly introduce them and will paste their bios in the chat. The author of the Translanguaging for Multilingual Immigrant Students is Dr. Maite Sánchez, Associate Investigator at CUNY-IIE and Assistant Professor of Bilingual Education at Hunter, also CUNY. The author of the Trauma-Informed Practices modules is Ashley Busone-Rodríguez, project researcher at CUNY-IIE and bilingual teacher at Dos Puentes Elementary in the New York City Public Schools. And now, to start us off on our first module, Doctora Sánchez.
Gracias, thank you. Merci. Grazie mille. I'm very excited to be here around so many educators. I'm seeing the participants list. It's a long list. And thank you for everybody who has put your name in the chat and your where are you coming from. So we have from a lot of places, which is part of this idea of translanguaging for immigrant communities. So I'm Maite Sánchez. I'm the author of the module, the CUNY-IIE module on translanguaging for multilingual immigrant students. So I think here in this webinar, we have the essence of translanguaging for immigrant students. So thank you. So if you haven't introduced yourself, please go ahead and introduce yourself. What you see here, what I will be doing in the next few minutes is try to give you a little bit of a sense of what you will see in this professional development module. It was created with a lot of love, but also with a lot of educators that are with me in this journey and has been with me in community during this journey. So what you will see in this guide, it's activities that I do with my own pre-service and in-service teachers, but also activities that I have learned and I have seen educators engage with to understand translanguaging, and part of the CUNY-Initiative work that and the familia that we have created with teachers in New York and beyond. And also, I'm particularly grateful because a lot of this work also comes with educators who are here in our community in this webinar today. So we have educators from Dos Puentes Elementary School in Manhattan. So we have learned I have learned so much with them and from their students and families. I have educators here from PS212 in Queens who are very close to my heart as well. They have engaged amazing activities and an amazing journey with their families and their children on translanguaging. So thank you very much. And part of what you will see in these modules is this collective. So the modules I wanted to do and people who engage with this is to a collective learning on translanguaging. And that learning comes from our own experiences and from the experiences that we have with our immigrant origin students. And we think about immigrant origin students, we think about recent arrivals, New Yorkers, we think about students who have been labeled as English language learner, multilingual learners, have a family member that might be an immigrant, but we're also students that have not formally labeled as language learners through state assessments, but also live multilingual lives. So it's like for all these communities. And what you see here is a CUNY-IIE principle. So one of the guiding principles of this project, and you will see in the webpage, is teaching through translanguaging is central. And Ofelia and Khánh in their remarks have mentioned why it's so important to focus on translanguaging, but also the experiences, the trauma experience of our communities. And I haven't heard Ofelia speak about the Eyes Yellow, the Santa Cecilia. Now I want to go and listen and watch. But something that is really key and important as we think about translanguaging is to DIs for social and cognitive justice. And that translanguaging is not just activities. And that will be part of the module. So we have 2 activities in this module. And then we, next please, when we think in the module, we're going to be talking about one part of the module is really to understand the theory behind. So it's the theory about the student and the multilingual and bilingual student and family community, their experiences, really focusing on their experiences in terms of languaging and not in the experiences of thinking about languages as separate entities outside of ourselves. So we will be engaging in that conversation through the modules. As Ofelia mentioned, it's not only about a strategy. So really, educators, we need to engage in understanding what we are thinking and experiencing about translanguaging, because it is about not a strategy, but it's about, first, we have to understand how our language experiences are essential to who we are and our identities. And then the message that we get through schooling is coming from many times giving us the message as if our languages are inadequate or they're not good or not welcome. So the theory is really important, and that's the first module. But then also it is a pedagogical approach. So that corriente, once you have an understanding, and you have that understanding also by doing, so as we engage as a community, it's also thinking about ways in which teachers and other educators can strategically plan and support this translanguaging. And Ofelia Garcia mentioned the work of Garcia, Johnson, Seltzer. So we have that resource that we cannot see very well because of the background, but the translanguaging classroom, and they discuss 4 aspects or 4 goals related to social justice and racial justice for translanguaging, and you see here in this slide. So each of the modules, so one module really focused on the theory and the other one more on the practical approach, but they're really interconnected. I will go very briefly with explaining a little bit what we go into in the modules. So please, Daniela, the next slide. So the first module is called Understanding Translanguaging in Education. It entire is a module, the first activity in the module. We expect that you will do it in a couple of hours. Again, we'll be a facilitator, but ideally, and we have some additional resources for facilitators, but also to be working in communities. And the goal for this activity that has sub-activities is to discuss the main ideas on translanguaging theory and the relationship with multilingual immigrants communities. So we start because the central piece are these immigrant communities. Next, please. The first activity of the module, it's reading about some students and their language practices. And here you have a little picture of one of or 2 of the 3 students that we feature. And what we ask is, after participants engage in reading about these students, to engage in questions like, what observations can you make about a student's language practices? These students at home, with friends, in the community, at school. What wonderings do you have with those students? So that's how we start centering and grounding the work on students, on their language practice, on the richness that what they have in their life, who they are, is so incredible. And that's how we focus and we start this module. After this module, we give some text for you to engage, some videos. You will be engaging in one and then going to your fellow module participants and engage with them and share your ideas and their ideas. You're going to be seeing more videos, suggested videos about translanguaging in action. So the idea is that during these 2 hours, the group of educators that engage together in this practice can really have those conversations grounded on the students, on videos, on text, on your own experiences, and have those conversations and really think about this translanguaging not only as a pedagogy or just strategies, but something that is so essential for multilingual, bilingual communities. And that's what you will go through together. And then the expectation is that we all engage with this theme with different perspectives and different experiences with this. So the idea is that we build with each other. And then next one. So the second activity of this module, again, has several smaller activities. Participants will incorporate translanguaging pedagogy into their educational context. So they're really thinking about for their own students and in their communities. They will be, we expect that people will do this activity after a little bit of some time has passed from the first one, because, you know, there's a lot of things that will come up. So we start the module by asking what has happened since the first one and really engage in some questions about, you know, why are you wondering at this point? Where is it going? How has it going in terms of from the last time to now? So that's an introductory activity. We then, the next one, then we want definitely to look at some strategies, because even though it's not only about strategies, also educators need to plan instruction. They have to leverage, have to think about when, in which situations, for which objectives. So we provide an opportunity to engage in some activities that come from the CUNY-Initiative Translanguaging Guide. So participants will read one of the strategies, but then we'll engage with other colleagues that read other ones. So by the end of the conversation, people who have been engaging with this module will have some additional ideas, and they can also bring from their own experiences. And then we do want people to start really thinking about their own context and their practices. So part of this is like, now think about your students, think about something that you can do that is concrete. Maybe it's an activity, maybe it's a lesson, maybe a unit. Think about what do you want to do in your classroom, get some ideas from your colleagues. And part of this module is really to end up with some concrete next steps that you can do in your classroom. So this module has 2 activities, and we understand that these are just the beginning for richer conversations, and then hopefully there is some space for people to grow and then continue to engage and share their practice. The module also have some additional resources for facilitators, resources that are text or that they're videos, for anybody to engage with, and they're going to be free of charge in the CUNY-IIE webpage. So we're very excited to learn what you will be doing with the module. So please write me, the CUNY-IIE team, to learn how you are using these modules and any suggestions for next steps. So the other module that the CUNY-IIE is releasing is a trauma-informed practice. So I want to introduce Ashley Busone-Rodríguez, who is the creator of the next module, and she's going to be walking us through what she has created.
Thank you so much, Maite. Thanks everyone for being here. It's so exciting to have such a great turnout to learn about 2 really important topics, especially right now. I think Dr. Lê did a nice job of contextualizing where we're at right now as a world global community. And so I think this is very timely. So as Tatyana mentioned, I teach 3rd grade at a bilingual school in Washington Heights. And last year, I'm going to tell you a story about last year. There was one week where I received a new student every single day in my classroom. And this is unique because although we have many new immigrant students in our community in Washington Heights, every single day is a lot. And if you're a classroom teacher, you understand that this is stressful, right? So each of those students had their own stories, and those are not my stories to tell, but I can share with you that it was very overwhelming, to say the least. Many of these students had experienced immense loss. There was family separation and sickness and the physical and emotional burdens that come with migration. There were a lot of tears in 3rd grade that week. Notably, there was one student who cried from 8 a.m. until it was lunchtime. And thankfully, we have a stellar support staff, and there was a social worker and a counselor and a parent coordinator and many others involved in supporting this little girl. But we tried every trauma-informed trick in the book, and it was still just very difficult. So I want to kind of focus on that. This child had endured more than most adults ever will, and what she really needed from us was connection. She needed consistency. She needed to be in lockstep. She needed us to be in lockstep with her family so that we were well informed of what was going on with them, and we needed to listen. That day has really stuck with me, less because of the little girl who's doing really well now, but more because of my colleagues in our amazing school community. I've learned so much from these folks, and so many of them are here tonight. So shout out to Dos Puentes. I've learned so much with them and from them about how to support immigrant students and their families. I think the major takeaway here is that this work is never done alone. Dr. Lay mentioned that this is collective, that trauma can be collective, and I also think that healing has to be collective and connected. So our administrators at Dos Puentes have prioritized and welcomed trauma-informed professional development for opportunities for our staff. They've prioritized funding mental health professionals in our school. Our teachers have taken it upon themselves to attend workshops and read books and do the learning that it takes to employ best practices and to do right by students who've endured trauma. But this work really is never done alone. And I truly believe, as I said, that the first step to healing is connection. And I know that my community and my learning community is connected. We work to connect with our students. So many of our immigrant students and refugee students have likely experienced first or secondhand trauma in the traditional sense by virtue of the fact that they've moved to a new place and they might have been separated from family. And trauma goes beyond one's own lived experiences, and it transcends, as Dr. Lay tells us, into a collective and trans trauma, right? So CUNY-IIE is built on several grounding principles, one of which is that we know that migration can be traumatic. So if we think of a Western traditional notion of trauma, we tend to think of individuals, and the National Child Traumatic Stress Network says that a traumatic event is one that is frightening or dangerous or violent, that it threatens a child's life or bodily integrity, but also that witnessing a traumatic event or being a part of a family that has witnessed traumatic events that threaten the security of loved ones can also be traumatic. So it's particularly important when we're thinking about our youngest children, as their sense of safety actually really depends on the perceived safety of their attachment figures. So if we think about our classrooms, it might not just be the one student that you have, but also what has happened in their life and with their community. Trauma can be so much more, as Dr. Lay mentioned, and it shows up in so many ways. It's not just this fight or flight. It's not just this black or white thing. So Daniela, you can change the slide. Supporting people who've been affected by trauma is both important and very complex. It can be confusing to identify trauma responses and very difficult to determine helpful strategies. So that's what this module is all about. We created this to be a very simple introduction into how trauma may show up in your classroom. And we really want you to use these modules. They're accessible, they're free, they're made for you to share. If you go to the next slide, Daniela, you can see that also we want you to look at different strategies for supporting students who've endured trauma. Once you've been able to recognize it and understand it, then what do you do about it? How do you support students? And Dr. Lay mentioned so many wonderful ideas. I'm not an expert on trauma-informed practice, but I am a teacher who's deeply committed to learning and to showing up for my students in ways that my own teachers couldn't do for me as a kid. So this module has ideas from experts and professionals that I admire so much. I want to tell the stories of Arlen Casimir, Courtney Baker, Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot, Conley, and so many more. And I see my role here as a compiler and a facilitator, and I thank each of them endlessly for their contributions in this field. Daniela, will you change the slide? So until you all have time to read and share the module, which I hope you will, here are 3 simple trauma-informed practices that I think you could probably walk away and use in your learning community tomorrow. The first is to really integrate social emotional learning into your classroom wherever possible to support the development of vocabulary and structures in any language that will help students express their feelings and ask for help. We need to model this language, and we need to make time for sharing, like Dr. Lay mentioned. We need to create spaces for connection. We should validate and regulate our own emotions along the way so that we can help students do the same. So when I think back to that day with that little girl, the day she showed up, I was completely overwhelmed. Her crying, it was incessant, and it really just triggered something inside of me that I could feel my heart racing, my palms were sweating, the whole stress response was beginning, and thankfully I was able to rely on a colleague to give me a moment to collect myself before I worked with her again. I could assure this little girl that I would be back, that I would be a safe and predictable person for her in this new situation, while also taking care of my own needs and regulating my own nervous system. Sort of like a put your own mask on first type of scenario. So I think I might have said something like, Miss Busone's feeling really overwhelmed right now. I'm going to try taking some deep breaths and drinking some water. I just need a few minutes, and then I'll be right back to sit with you when this timer is up. And then I did come back, right? We have to follow through with that word. Second is to create a safe and predictable environment for students. This might seem very obvious, but simple practices like going over the daily schedule or foreshadowing events that might happen that day can make a huge difference to students who've gone through major and unpredictable transitions like migration. So when new students join my classroom, they're assigned a buddy who takes them through the whole day. They answer all their questions. And I work hard to make sure that transitions and routines can be predictable and understandable for them. When I know something ahead of time, I tell my students. I don't keep secrets from kids. Surprises, maybe, but never secrets. So I might say something like, hey, we're having an evacuation drill sometime today. Everything is safe, but here's how it might look and sound. And then finally, as Dr. Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot says, we must become curious rather than furious about the behaviors of our students. So if we think about behavior as communication, then challenging behaviors are really telling us that someone is in need of support, right? We can think about this on a communal level as well. This requires a major mindset shift and a shift in our language as well. Instead of thinking, why won't this kid stop hitting other people? I'm working on trying to train myself to think, I wonder why this student is hitting her peers, right? What might have happened to her that makes her react this way? We could extrapolate this to communities and world events, right? We could think about, I wonder why this community is acting this way. I wonder what made them what happened to them to make them act this way, right? So I feel so privileged to be with all of these amazing folks tonight and sharing what's on my mind and my heart. I'll end by saying that my wish for all children all around the world is that they may find communities that welcome and shelter them from the evil that's surrounding us all. Paulo Freire taught us that all education is political, and so I don't mind saying to you tonight that it is not only an option, but also an obligation to protect children by moving toward policies that support family reunification, support the end of violence, and the mental health of all community members. And this work, I believe, begins in our very own classrooms. Trauma-informed practice is not an option, it's a requirement of the socio-political landscape that we find ourselves in right now. So many of our students are affected by these harsh realities, and that's why this module is more important than ever before. So I thank CUNY-IIE and I thank NYSED for the opportunity to have shared this with all of you. I hope you'll find these modules useful and that you'll share them widely with your colleagues. I hope you'll push for more training on trauma-informed practice in your community. I hope you'll vote and push your elected officials to push for all of the above, and that you'll continue to work together for supporting all immigrant students.
Thank you so much, Ash, for not only sharing the module, but sharing your passion and sharing your students in your classroom with us. Thank you, Maite, for bringing the whole Translanguaging comunidad together, because there's been so much work that has gone into this. And now the modules are officially launched. They're on the website and they are ready for your use because they need to be used, because we need to see translanguaging and we need to see trauma-informed practices in all of our classrooms. And so now we have a little time, and I want to thank all our speakers. Everyone was amazingly punctual, even early to an extent. That almost never happens. So I want to thank them for being so punctual. So that way we have time for questions. However, we only so far have over 200 people in the room, but only one question. And I know these people in this room, in the Zoom room with us, they're an inquisitive bunch. So feel free, don't be shy to add your questions, but we will go ahead and get started, and any of our panelists can jump in. It doesn't matter if you talk to us about trauma or about translanguaging. We want to continue hearing from you. So this is from Chris Velache. They say, I teach ESL to adult refugees, asylum seekers, and immigrants. Some have formal schooling and some have interrupted basic education. Some have no literacy skills in their native languages. Is it safe to assume that translanguaging is beneficial to the ESL adults I serve?
So I can start. I think that if you think that what you're supposed to do when you teach is use all the resources that you have available, of course. And if you think of translanguaging as giving your students, adult students in this case, the freedom to use the resources that they already have. And whether they have literacy, advanced literacy or not, they have resources to make meaning. They have led lives for a very long time. So therefore, I do think that unless you start with what they have, you're not going to be able to advance anything. I just want to give you an image that I didn't have time to give you today, which is the string of pearls that I have been working with, because I think what you have is you have people that have pearls, some more than others, but what you're doing, of course, is you're extending those pearls, but you cannot extend the pearls. You cannot have additional pearls without the pearls that they already have. So it's, again, it's about giving these adult students the same respect and freedom that everybody has, that everybody should be given when engaged in a learning situation.
And just to add something, just a little bit more, is this people that you'll be engaging with, besides the experience that they have that might be very different of what is expected in your classroom, and you have the goal to teach them English, they have also received a lot of messages about that their experiences are not good, that they're less than others, that their practices, and the fact that they are in a space to learn English is that because they're lacking something. So this idea of translanguaging and trauma-informed is really understanding the humanity, the shared humanity that we have, and that welcome, embrace, and really also learning from them. So even though we are in these spaces in which, you know, we have to follow particular ideas and curriculum, is that we have to start from this shared humanity, from the curiosity that we have about their experiences, and the fact that you and all of us as educators need to learn from them, with them, and it through languaging practices that might not be familiar for us. So we also have to remember that piece ourselves, and how can we be giving spaces to uplift and also to learn with them and from them as well.
I also just want to add, because adult education is my first love. It was where my career started. And I think one of the things that we know is a major difference between child and adult learners is that affective filter is really high as you get older, right? And so it's scary, it's difficult to learn a new language as you get older, or you think it's more difficult. There's a myth there too, but it's a very emotional process, and language is so tied to our emotions. And so, as Dr. Garcia and Dr. Sánchez mentioned, I think it's a really powerful process, especially with adults. And so I would really highly recommend, and I would encourage you to reach out for resources on that too.
Thank you. I'm going to shift a little bit to trauma, even though there's, you know, connections, and I think Ofelia said that the weaving of the two. If I may, one of my own questions is, how do we move between individual trauma and collective trauma, right? And what does that look like? And then related to the modules specifically, this is from Kelly Griffith, Tanaka, don't see her full last name there, from Ms. Busone. Are trauma-informed practices broken down by age or grade level? She says her kindergarten students would greatly appreciate that.
Can I answer that a little
Please.
bit? I think it's being curious about why students' behavior, as Ashley earlier, how can we shift from individual to the body, how individual to the institutions, is what caused that behavior in the classroom, you know, and considering where that community, which community that students come from, whether it's refugees from Southeast Asia or immigrants from the borders crossing, right? So we look at that, and we look at the political context of what's going on right now in the world, and that, you know, we're gonna have refugees from the Middle East and what's going on. So I think that's how we be curious about the behavior and not look at the behavior as something that's disruptive. And I think that's important. And as we shift our thinking from the individual to the institution, and not asking what's wrong with that individual, what caused, what social political costs.
Yeah, I can pick up.
Unfortunately, you're breaking up a little bit, so you're freezing, but we hear your audio, but you're just so everyone knows that's what's happening. So I'm gonna thank you for that response, and I'll pass it on to Ashley.
I'll add on, and thanks, Kelly, for being here. I think one thing that we know, again, as Tatyana mentioned, is that all of this of language and trauma and all of this is connected to human development. And so what we know about the brain and human growth and development, right? Of course, things are age, they differ by different ages and different grades. And so in the module, I hope that you'll enjoy, there's a jigsaw of resources there. I worked really hard to put stuff together that I thought would work for, you know, ages 0 to 110 or however old we're getting now. And I think the most important thing there is to look through and see what works for your community, because even something that might work well for one 7-year-old might not work for a different 7-year-old, right? Context really matters there. Language matters, race matters, all of these things. The socio-political sphere matters so much. And so, yes, you should definitely find things for your kindergarten students, but also maybe for yourself and for your own colleagues and for other folks at your school.
Thank you. A question from Roseni Ramirez. How can I explain translanguaging to parents? For example, during parent-teacher conferences.
I think you tell parents that when their children are home, they are allowed most of the time to use all the resources they have. You do not tell them you can use only resources in this room and not resources in that other room. And because what you want is you want a holistic experience. And so I think this is the same logic that you use with parents. These are resources that we have, and what we're trying to do is make sure that we leverage all those resources to make sure that we extend the children's or the adults' languaging, but making sure that it is brought from their own bodies and their own lives. I just want to say something about the individual and the political, because Khan's answer reminded me, which is the same thing with the translanguaging corriente of the individual. The translanguaging corriente of the individual is also impacted by the corriente in the school and the corriente in the political context. So these are things, you know, things are messy, and the task that teachers have is a great one, and I appreciate all of your work.
Thank you. The next question is from Allison Mazer. They say, I teach ENL to 6th and 7th graders. I also found out that my students experience horrific trauma in their journey here: violence, suicide, and murder. I learned about this from my mentor, ENL teacher, who heard about this from their parents. How can I help my students share their stories without triggering their traumatic experiences?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think I can say from my personal experience is that you don't know, so you have to center the students, what the student is comfortable with, you know. And I tend to use the arts to help students share the story. And I use sometimes poetry to connect to their own lived experience. And it's their comfort level to share what, you know, what they learn from the poetry, what they hear from the poetry, what they see from the documentary, what they see from the play, and and that they connect to that, and then they will share. And it's up to them to share what they're comfortable with. And I tend to emphasize the arts a lot in terms of not triggering their traumatic experiences, but by connecting, and also that solidarity, the community, by being together, by connecting students together, helps.
We don't have time. What I would like to do, I'd like to put each. Did anyone want to add anything onto that? Thank you, Khánh. Right, I think it's meeting students where they are and definitely not pushing them to share anything they're not comfortable with sharing, giving them the option to share, but not being required to share. I want to close. We have a few announcements, but first I want each panelist, if they could say one charge, right, to the folks that are here in this room, the folks who are educators, the folks who are professors. Where do we go from here? Because the world is becoming more and more complicated for us as educators and for our students and families. So just one sentence to kind of inspire folks or to give folks some light to where we need to go. Why don't I call on folks to make it easier? Maite, can I call on you first?
Sure. So for me, it's all about community. So relying on your community and having conversations with your community and be curious with your community.
Thank you. Khánh.
I the same. I think that collectivism and that community, being in touch with the community, and also centering your students and also centering you is important too. Your voice as educators is important. It's very important, and I would like to thank you that and remind that of you of that.
Thank you, Khánh. Ashley?
Sure. I just, right before we got on this call, read an article in the Times about how our mayor is pulling back a lot of funding for public schools. And so I think that just leads me to the charge again of we need to hold these people accountable to what is happening in our community, not just in New York City, but in New York State and in this world. We need to vote for folks who are going to truly support immigrant students, all students in all ways in terms of language, trauma, etc.
Thank you. And Ofelia?
Well, my mentor, Pat Carini, always used to say that human capacity is widely distributed. So I would charge everybody on this call, on this webinar, to make sure that you find the strength and the capacity that every student has, whether they're children or adults or immigrants or not. And find the trauma, but don't focus on the trauma. Focus on the strengths, and I think you will do much better.
I take each of those, and I hope we all take each of those and on our journey as we go step by step, day by day. Thank you. Muchísimas gracias to our panelists. I have a few slides to share as we wrap up. So first, as we close, I would like to thank each of you for joining us for the CUNY-IIE modules launch. I'd also like to publicly and emphatically thank Daniela Alulema, our project director, for all her behind-the-scenes work, along with Lorena Modesto and Leslie Jimenez. I would also like to remind you that our modules can be used in two ways. First, you can take them into your pre-K to 12 schools and implement some or all of the activities with faculty and staff, and we really hope you do. Or if you're a pre-K to 12 New York State educator, you can join one of our free CTLE classes, one of which Ashley teaches, that we'll be sharing more about on our listserv and all of our many, many social media platforms. So please connect with us and visit our website for all of our resources and our upcoming events. And if we can move to the next slide, speaking of events, I would also like to invite those of you who are in and around the New York City area to join us in person, for the premiere of the video series called Not Too Young: Immigration in Elementary Schools. It features the work of PS 340 in the Bronx, PS 212 in Jackson Heights, Queens, and two of our rockstar teachers, Kelly Griffith Tanaka and Marina Velasquez, who are here today, are featured, and they will blow your minds, and also the Children's School of Rochester. We have not forgotten about Western New York. The event will take place at the Aaron Davis Hall Theater. It seats 600, so we have plenty of space for everyone on the campus of the City College of New York on Tuesday, December 5th from 5 to 7 p.m. It's free and open to all. I want to say gracias, spasiba, kamun, from all of us at CUNY-IIE.